Welcome to the current episode of the ISAS podcast series, where we are delighted to have with us Dr. and Professor Sanjay Kathuria, who is our guest today. Sanjay Kathuria is somebody who has been with us before on the ISAS podcast series, and many of you might already be knowing him, not just through his presence on this series, but also through the vast body of work and research that he has done in a very distinguished career. We are very glad to share that right now, Dr. Kathuria is a non-resident senior fellow with the Institute of South Asian Studies. In addition to that, he holds adjunct professorships with the Georgetown University in the United States of America, as well as with the Ashoka University in India. And prior to that, he left behind a long career of very distinguished policy research work at the World Bank, where he was the lead economist of the South Asian region. Welcome, Dr. Kathuria, to today's conversation.
Thank you very much, Amitendu. I'm delighted to be here, as always.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. And today we are discussing with you something which is a bit unusual subject in the sense that most subjects with respect to the South Asian region tend to touch India, at least peripherally, if not significantly, practically in all conversations, simply because of its size. But today's conversation is connected to two other major economies of the region, and these are Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And you are perhaps the best person to reflect on the subject that we aim to discuss, which is essentially the currency swap that's just been announced between Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, because you have been following the region in totality. So what I would like to start off with, Dr. Kathuria, is by alluding to this recent $200 million, Singapore $200 million currency swap between Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Now, what is interesting about this arrangement is that Bangladesh has been, quote unquote, the donor country in this regard on the swap. And it is also perhaps for the first time that Bangladesh has stepped into this territory of extending a currency swap arrangement to another economy. A move which, at least in the South Asian region, is usually associated with the largest economy of the region, that is India. Now, would you think that this is, in a way, a reflection of the changing economic balance of power within South Asia? How do you view this announcement from a South Asian perspective?
Thank you, Amitendu, for that. It's a good way to start this discussion. Yeah, I mean, perhaps it's too early to say that there is a changing balance of power, but I certainly think that it reflects the dynamics of the last few years in the region, where Bangladesh has been growing at a healthy clip, and all the other countries have been seeing declines, including in India, has been showing a sharp slowdown in its growth rate, as you know, even before COVID. So, and I really unhesitatingly welcome this change, or this hopefully this will continue, because I think for South Asia it is good to have someone other than India also to focus on, and so I welcome this. So I will amplify on this. I have 4 or 5 reasons why I think this is good for the region. So first, as I was saying, that it helps the region move away from its fixation on India, and provides opportunities for more meaningful non-India bilateral partnerships. Right? So that's one. Secondly, also it helps India to be less dominant in the region. And I can take an example from energy. Right? So if you look at the BBIN space, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, they have been discussing bilateral and trilateral energy cooperation within the region. And For example, Nepal has always been worried that India will be too dominant a buyer of its energy, of its power exports. Now, with India having allowed this arrangement of trilateral, the power to be wheeled through India from Nepal to Bangladesh, and now with Bangladesh in a position to buy increasing amounts of power from Nepal and from, in fact, from Bhutan, when that eventually, when this happens. So this can reduce, for example, Nepal's fear of being too dependent on India as a buyer. So I think that is a second reason for welcoming in Bangladesh's rise. Thirdly, the Bangladesh-India nexus itself, I think, it becomes stronger. The growth of Bangladesh's middle class, its multinational firms who are investing in India and in Africa. Now, all of this strengthens the largest bilateral partnership in South Asia. It's already the largest partnership. It can deepen further, and it's a win-win for both countries. The fourth reason is Bangladesh itself. I think its growth improves its own self-confidence, its role in India's Act East policy. It will now enable and push, in fact, for growing connectivity between India and Bangladesh, and more broadly in this BBIN and BIMSTEC region, because I think it will become more confident in its own, in its own strength and its economic power. And lastly, I think all other countries in the region can certainly learn from Bangladesh's experience of prudent macroeconomic management and debt management. And I think all of these factors put together are welcome, and they will help to reduce the trust deficit that is induced by India's disproportionate economic weight in the region.
I think, Dr. Kathuria, what you point out is very significant, because Bangladesh really has been in a sense, the brightest spot in the South Asian development experience, at least for the last 10 to 15 years, looked at in totality. India might have been growing at a much faster rate, but Bangladesh probably has been able to take strides in a way which many had not expected from it. Particularly, it's not yet even 5 decades that Bangladesh was actually famously referred to as the basket case. So I just wanted to deflect on this point at a time when we are really talking about the fact that Bangladesh has managed its macro economy rather well in a fairly distinguished fashion. If we cast our attention to the other economy in the space of our discussion today, Sri Lanka, and it seems a little sad in the sense that Sri Lanka probably began the development journey in its own trajectory in the region with the most outward-oriented economic policies, unfortunately later entered into this tragic trajectory of civil conflict, which led to enormous loss of lives and investor confidence. And probably what we are getting to see, in spite of the conflict having ended for more than 10 years now, there appears to be some rather disturbing aspects to the way Sri Lanka has been managing its macro economy, primarily in terms of the very large volume of debt that it has compiled. And there have been concerns over the kind of borrowings that Sri Lanka has been making, not just from the private debt markets, but also from countries like China and Korea, many of which are going into investments like the Hambantota port, which have been controversial. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka as an economy at this juncture, and this is an economy which clearly needs a quick economic turnaround, it needs macroeconomic stability, it needs its balance of payments and internal debt and public finance managements to become much more stable and robust. What would you think should be the right way forward for the Sri Lankan economy at this stage?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just begin with a little bit of context and elaborate on what you were saying. So as you were saying that, there was for a couple of years, for 3 years actually, after the war ended in 2009, there was a post-war boom, but it was driven by unsustainable increases in government spending, including mega infrastructure projects like the Hambantota port that you mentioned. So its growth, which was going at 8 to 9% after the war, it plummeted to 2.3% in 2019, which was the pre-COVID year. And of course, last year, 2020, it was negative 3.6%. But worryingly, all of this, the external debt kept growing, and it went up from less than 40% in 2010 to 55% in 2014, and then 69% in 2019. And now, and this has increased further. And all of this increase, or most of this increase, has in fact originated in the public sector. So the latest economic update of the World Bank in spring casts Sri Lanka as facing a higher risk of debt sustainability. And if you look at overall, and it's been downgraded by the rating agencies as well, the overall debt to GDP ratio in Sri Lanka in 2021 is now at a massive 115%. Now, just in context, Bangladesh is 42%. So that gives you right there the reason why we've had this, the flipping of the places in Bangladesh as a lender. Now, but as you were mentioning, I think the crisis, the roots of the crisis are a bit deeper than just this, the splurge in government spending. And I think the roots are in trade. As you said, Sri Lanka was the first economy in South Asia to start liberalizing its economy. But this course was reversed in 2000, in the early 2000s, and we have documented in the World Bank report that we did in 2018, the glass half full, where it started levying non-transparent para-tariffs, all kinds of, which they gave them different names, but in effect, there were tariffs which were not reported. But if you include para-tariffs in the calculation of tariffs, then the reported tariffs double, the average reported tariffs actually double. And so an already protected economy, even just looking at plainly, the reported tariffs, it becomes even more protected, and protection rates are in excess of 22% on average in the economy. And this hides even, dispersion, much higher effective protection in sectors that are of domestic interest. So there is an increasing anti-export bias in the economy. There are current account deficits every year, trade deficits, and all of this impulses actually have seen a boost in the new government, which took power in 2019. So they've actually received a further boost. And so, it always astounds me that these numbers that I'm about to give you, all of which I said, the trade bias, the anti-export bias, is reflected in trade numbers. Trade to GDP ratio in Sri Lanka was peaked at about 89% in 2000, but it declined to 46% in 2010 and rose a little bit by 2019, but it was still only just over 50%, 52% in 2019, and similarly in exports to GDP. But I think this decline in trade is, especially for a small, modern, open economy, I think is without precedent that I have not heard of this. I have not seen this happening anywhere else in the world. And this decline was happening at a time when, especially in the first decade of the 2000s, when world trade was booming. And South Asia was capturing a growing share of world exports and world trade. And South Asia trade to GDP ratio, at the same time, Sri Lanka was plummeting. In the rest of South Asia, including, the figures include Sri Lanka, but that was small. The South Asia trade to GDP ratio went up from 29% in 2000 to about 51% in 2008. So, this shows the growing contrast between Sri Lanka and the rest of South Asia. So, I think what is implicit in what I have said is the way forward for Sri Lanka, which is the question that you asked. It has to embrace trade. It cannot, as a small economy, it simply cannot continue the anti-export bias that currently is the centerpiece of its trade policy. The previous government signed an FTA with Singapore. It was never implemented. It needs to carry that forward. It needs to, again, for many years, there have been, so many rounds of talks of trade, a free trade agreement with China, never happened. And again, for a decade, they have been discussing a deepening of its free trade agreement with India. It hasn't yet happened. So this needs to, the trade, the embrace of trade for a small economy is completely, it's necessary for it to turn around its overall, the anemic trade, in fact, the negative growth rate that it's been seeing. So the trade hesitancy has to be done away with. It does not actually come, it is making massive investments in trade infrastructure, such as the Hambantota port, expanding Colombo port. This does not sit well with the anti-export bias in trade. Okay, so to complement these investments, it has to embrace trade. Secondly, it has to give space to the private sector and not become a public sector driven economy, right? So therefore, it needs a lot of improvements in its investment climate, which I think it issues that it shares with the rest of South Asia, but there are particular things in Sri Lanka, and the economy needs to be driven by the private sector, domestic investment, and foreign investment. And finally, there are many other things, but these are the three things I want to focus on. Finally, I think it needs to take a very close look at debt management and subject new government investment. What's in the past is done, but subject new government investment to very close to rigorous cost benefit analysis and public scrutiny, right? Otherwise, we don't want future investments to go the way of having very low and often perhaps negative social returns that we have seen in many projects of the past.
I think that was really very illustrative, Dr. Kathuria, and you covered a very wide expanse of reasons explaining what's going wrong with the Sri Lankan economic management. And I think one of the points that you alluded to, perhaps the core of your argument, was the fact that a country like Sri Lanka could not really capitalize the opportunity that it had of engaging much more in global trade integration and the benefits it could have obtained out of it, primarily out of its aggressive export orientation, which again is something that we see for Bangladesh. We do see very clearly that Bangladesh is probably, if I'm not mistaken, then in the entire South Asian region, Bangladesh is probably the best example of manufacturing export growth driven industrialization and the kind of benefits that it has brought for the economy. However, you also alluded to the fact that Bangladesh has room to grow further. And I wanted to contextualize this with the current situation in Bangladesh, which is basically that of Bangladesh going to graduate from an LDC to a non-LDC status within another 2.5 to 3 years. It successfully covered all the milestones, but the moment it does that, it faces this rather significant challenge of losing the non-reciprocal unilateral preferential access that it has in the world's most major markets, including the European Union, where it enjoys the everything but arms preferential access, and in other many OECD countries. And we also note the fact that Bangladesh exports have got a bit, uncharacteristically concentrated around garments and apparels. So keeping these two at the back of our argument and looking at the fact that probably Bangladesh will need to keep focusing on trade as its most powerful engine of growth as it goes ahead, what do you think should be Bangladesh's trade and export strategy going ahead? And I just want to add this thought for your consideration that Bangladesh, surprisingly, has not shown that great activism for entering into free trade agreements till now, at least. So, how do you actually want to sum this up?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think I agree that as I had mentioned in my piece, Bangladesh certainly has room to grow both domestically and through trade. Uh, and in the trade front, both garments and other merchandise and service exports. But let me just give one a quick point before I get into that on macro, because I think it differentiates it from Sri Lanka, and we already hinted at it. But it is, in fact, one reason why Bangladesh has been a success story is, in a sense, because it has lived within its means. Right? It is very sound macroeconomic management, perhaps the best in South Asia. External debt is only 17 to 18% of GDP. And of course, part of the reason for this is the steady increase in its growth rate, which meant the denominator was growing very fast. So the debt to GDP ratio was under control. But obviously, it is partly that is an endogenous phenomenon because it has managed its debt well and not crowded out the private sector. Therefore, it has given the private sector room to grow. So now on the export story, yes, it is, it shares some of the problems of Sri Lanka, but it is a more nuanced and a a much greater success story than has been Sri Lanka's export story. And exports have played a role in the Bangladesh's growth success. They've grown as a share of GDP. Just you look at the contrast now. Although Bangladesh is a much bigger economy, much bigger country, but in 2004, both countries had the same level of exports, exactly the same 7.4 billion in 2004, 7.3 billion goods and services exports, right? Now, 15 years later in 2019, Sri Lanka's exports were 19 billion, Bangladesh were 46 billion, right? So there you have it, right? Uh, now, so now, obviously, Bangladesh needs to diversify, as you mentioned, right? Um, Now, let me provide some numbers here again. Uh, Bangladesh exports around 30 to 40 billion dollars of garments, right? Now, I'm first coming to the garments argument that it has room even in garments, but then it needs to go beyond garments. Right? So let's start with garments first. So it exports 30 to 34 billion worth of garments. China, which has been gradually reducing its share of world garments exports. It had garments exports. I was looking at the numbers yesterday. Garments exports were about 145 billion in 2018, and in 2020 they went down to about 124 billion. But it is still by far the most dominant player. And as this goes down, then the other two biggest players, Vietnam and Bangladesh, have a lot of room to grow, right? Because they're both doing 30 to 35 billion. China is still doing 124 billion. So, the graph can go in an opposite direction for these three countries. And in addition to garments, Bangladesh should be growing in other labor-intensive sectors because it has done well in mass manufacturing. As you said, Bangladesh's merchandise exports are 83% of those are occupied by garments, right? So there is a lot of room to also grow in non-garment sectors. Now, how can this be done here? And I think one, I will start with the tariff policy, which is very much resembles Sri Lanka's. There is a strong anti-export bias in its tariff and trade policy. Again, very high, these para tariffs and very high tariffs in sectors of domestic interest, and which hurts new exporters, potential exporters. So this needs to be fixed, and it has shown reluctance to change this. When I was there, posted in Bangladesh for 3 years, we tried a lot to work on this, but we didn't get very far. And this continues to be an issue of where Bangladesh really needs to work very hard. Second aspect, which is related, is Bangladesh needs to provide non-discriminatory treatment to its own domestic sectors. Currently, its regime is just cocoons and shelters the garments industry, and it provides fantastic duty-free treatment to imports which are needed for the garments industry through the what it calls its bonded warehouse regime. But this regime doesn't go to other sectors. And therefore, the other sectors do not enjoy that sheltering that the garment sector does. And it is high time that very good bonded warehouse regime is extended now to other sectors of the economy in the same way that it is extended to garments. And three, it needs to improve logistics, right? So the ranking of 2018 in the last World Bank Logistics Performance Index, Bangladesh was ranked at 100, right? So it needs to improve its ports, the customs clearances, the internal goods movement, and the overall turnaround time. So because this is, this we certainly know this is a very critical factor in trade. And finally, the issue that you raised, Amitendu, with graduation and the whole issue of FTAs, I agree with you 100%. That yes, there is, Bangladesh will not continue to enjoy after 3 or 4 years the same treatment and the unilateral preferences that has been enjoying so far since 1971, and it has been very hesitant to embrace overall trade, the anti-export bias that exists in its trade policy. I'm happy to note that it is now at least officially endorsed the idea of a free trade, in fact, a comprehensive economic partnership with India. And in the MOU, in the recent MOU between the two prime ministers, there is the idea that it will begin working. Both countries are now working on the contours of what a CEPA between India and Bangladesh might look like. And I hope that this will be the beginning of a starting to work on a framework. I think it's early days to say whether it will actually sign, a free trade agreement or a CEPA, but at least it is shown its willingness to start looking at the idea, and hopefully, it will be the beginning. And it is definitely needed because, countries will start demanding reciprocal market access that they have not done so far.
Kathuria, I think ultimately what we are probably getting to in a sense of a broader understanding when we look at these two economies, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and probably they started off on almost identical baselines, but there were expectations that were far more with respect to Sri Lanka than Bangladesh, and quite rightly so, because Sri Lanka's performance on the human development indicators has been remarkable. Even by developed country standards, it's been quite remarkable. But Bangladesh seems to have really surprised a lot of scholars, experts, and business people. And this is in spite, if one can argue, this is in spite of being a part of a region which over the last decade, certainly, if not more, has been witnessing very strong power rivalry, geopolitical power rivalry, primarily between China and India. And the relatively smaller countries are finding it rather hard to balance their interests between the two countries. And one of the outcomes has probably been what we popularly refer to as the debt trap diplomacy. And this is something when it is alluded to with respect to the region and Asia and generally the developing world at large that we talk about, Sri Lanka is often taken as an example, particularly the fact that projects like the Hambantota Port and elsewhere, and the recent Colombo Port City Economic Commission's bill, which the Sri Lankan legislature has passed, giving practically full control over land and assets of the Colombo Port City that is being built to the Chinese investors. Now, I wanted to check this with you that there are studies, there's good, strong research pointing to Sri Lanka's debt profile, external debt profile, very large debt profile, suggesting that, well, maybe it's not entirely the Chinese debt that's behind the current problems that Sri Lanka has. Perhaps it's largely because of the government irrationality in picking up private debt at very high coupon rates. But having said that, the Chinese debt continues to remain rather substantial. And it also remains the fact that not much of other external investor interest is being seen in Sri Lanka right now. So, in a sense, the Sri Lankan investor engagement with the Chinese economy and Chinese investors has probably been able to crowd out, as we say, a lot of other non-Chinese investors from the economy. Now, what does this mean for the Sri Lankan economy? Does it really mean that this is an economy which is uh, kind of in the grips of a very large power, geopolitical power like China, and in future, Sri Lanka's economic trajectory and economic fashion of development will, to a large extent, be guided by the obligations that it has entered into.
Yeah. so, so I think I would preface this by saying that, we cannot, if the implicit strategy in Sri Lanka is that, all of this will help me to grow and I can kind of grow my way out of debt. I think that doesn't work. We have seen that is not a sound strategy for debt management. So this is by way of preface initial remarks. And I would say also is that if there was an example, as I just mentioned, in South Asia, be like Bangladesh, not like Sri Lanka or Pakistan, when in terms of handling debt and government investment. Certainly, as you mentioned, the Chinese have become more and more prominent. Obviously, there are other debtors, especially official debtors. But in terms of the private sector, well, in the case of China, it is not private. I guess other bilateral debtors, China is becoming increasingly prominent. But I do want to, in this context, refer a little bit to the recent study, a very detailed study and careful study of 100 Chinese sovereign lending contracts, which was done globally by Aid Data, Peterson, the Center for Global Development, and Kiel. So they managed to get 100 contracts and studied them in a lot of depth. And here are 3 or 4 of the broadest conclusions. And I think borrowing countries would do well to study, to look at this study. So one is that there are far-reaching confidentiality clauses in these contracts with China to not disclose any contract terms. Sometimes even the existence of the loan itself is part of the contract, that deny or not disclose to the public that there exists such a loan. So there is non-transparency. Second is that of those 100 contracts, 30% by number and 55% by loan value, they required special bank accounts for security. Again, this is a non-transparent clause, collateral. The third was that 75% of the contracts did not have Paris Club clauses in them. That means they were excluded from the provisions of joint debt restructuring and comparable debt treatment. If there was default, then the normally Paris Club gets together and negotiates together with all other lenders. Well, 75% of the contracts did not have those clauses. And they also had cross-default clauses. That means you default on one, then you can, all the other, if you have other lending, then there is, that triggers those clauses. So you default on one, that means you're defaulting on all the other obligations from China. And then several contracts contained novel terms that amplified the lender's influence over the debtor's economic and foreign policies. So going just beyond the economic issues, it was broader, going beyond debt and debt management, going beyond to other broader economic policies, and even in some cases, even to foreign policies. Now, so I want to close this particular set of comments is by saying that, okay, all of this is there, but ultimately it is the borrower who enters into the contract, right? Nobody is forcing you to enter into this contract with China or any other lender, right? So that is why public debate, public scrutiny is so important. It takes two to conclude a deal, right? So on the borrower's side, what's happening there? Who's negotiating? Who's taking the final call on the loan and its terms? Is the loan debated ex ante before the deal is concluded? Is it debated in parliament? Is it debated in civil society? So I think all of this becomes very important. And we've seen this both in the case of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, that where such things of such debate and scrutiny has not been there, then the government has then run into issues of borrowing and being forced to go to many other lenders, and not least to the IMF. And it is not surprising, therefore, that the two of the most frequent borrowers in South Asia from the IMF are Pakistan and Sri Lanka. It's part of its the debt that it enters into, then it leads to them. They have to go to the lender of last resort, which is China, which is the IMF. And the reason why, with the comment that you made that there are not many others other than China in terms of bilateral lenders or even the private sector coming to Sri Lanka. And I think this goes back to the point that I made, is that Sri Lanka needs to have a much more open and transparent regime for foreign investment so that the private sector is energized and incentivized to enter. Otherwise, you will have, continue to have the kind of non-transparent deals, and this can lead to trouble, macroeconomic trouble, as we have seen.
Dr. Kathuria, it's always such a pleasure and fascinating learning from your insights. And we can go on, but I would like to round up and probably end our today's conversation with the most pressing concern of our time, that is the COVID-19, which continues to rage across South Asia. And we are really witnessing something which is not just unprecedented, but which is also very difficult to tackle in terms of the arsenal that countries need to tackle this. And I'm specifically referring to vaccinations. The problem that seems to be surfacing across most of South Asia is that apart from India, which has the capacities of producing its own vaccines, much as even such capacities are turning out to be short for the very large number of people that it has to vaccinate over a given period of time, both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are actually primarily relying on the WHO's COVAX facility for accessing vaccines, or the bilateral arrangements, some of which they have with India and a few other countries. But till now, they are both not having sufficient vaccines. And the possibilities of more waves, repeated waves coming back, new mutations cannot be discounted. And for countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, it is very difficult to persist with isolation, in the sense they just really can't keep their borders closed for a very long period of time. Now, we have discussed their respective macroeconomic characteristics at this point in time. We have discussed their performances, but I would be very keen on having as a final thought your take on how do you think access to vaccines and the ability to manage COVID can individually affect the prospects of these two countries, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, at this point in time?
Yeah, I think obviously the vaccination process is going to be the most critical in terms of recovery and how quickly recovery happens. Um, and there were certain pleasant upsides, especially remittances, this year for all of South Asia, and certainly for Bangladesh and Pakistan and Sri Lanka. So this was they negated predictions of about a decline, and this has been one of the things that has kept the at least that was part of the good news, and that has managed to put a downside on the decline in the economies and on poverty. But nevertheless, as you know, South Asia has been the hardest hit in the world, and obviously because of India and its weight in South Asia, in terms of the impact on the economy and also on poverty. But the recovery is fragile. Even though now the lockdowns are easing after the second wave and so on, the recoveries have been fragile. And according to the World Bank, for South Asia as a whole, the economic activity in 2021 will be 12% below the pre-COVID trend, right? And this may actually be worse now, because I think these projections were made just before the second wave hit. So I think here I'm certainly more confident about Bangladesh than about Sri Lanka, because I think those who were in a stronger fiscal position pre-COVID will definitely feel more confident. And Sri Lanka is in a tough place, it is having issues of not just the fiscal position but also on its foreign exchange position, which is why it went to Bangladesh. Again, yesterday or day before, the central bank announced a host of new restrictions on the use of foreign exchange, import restrictions and so on. So I think this does not bode well for the immediate future of Sri Lanka. Although obviously, as you said, it has some positives, especially on the social side and on in terms of the systems, health and education systems, which are more tougher and more resilient. But overall, if you look at in terms of economic health, I think even though all countries in South Asia have issues, those who were better off pre-COVID, especially in terms of the fiscal situation and the financial situation, will be better off now as COVID is with the recovery phase after COVID. But what COVID has exposed is gender inequity. It has exposed all the frailties and the vulnerabilities, the digital access, the plight of informal workers, and all of that. So I think along with vulnerable financial systems, which are true of both Bangladesh as well as Sri Lanka, they will need to address the vulnerability in the financial systems, because they've all had moratoriums on debt, and there's been debt forgiveness and so on. So I think recovery will be long and hard, perhaps less so in Bangladesh than in Sri Lanka. And one final word on South Asia: to the extent that supply chains overall are becoming, with the pressure for diversification to exit from China and all of that happened even before COVID. To the extent that supply chains are becoming more regional and more localized, South Asian countries should find new and old ways to work together, so that they can help to minimize or at least reduce the pains from COVID, and they can start with cross-border learning. Right? So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Dr. Kathuria, it's always such a fantastic pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much for being with us today on this ISAS podcast series. Thank you so much for sharing your very valuable insights.
Thank you, Amitendu. It was always a pleasure to work with you and ISAS and the team.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kathuria. Friends, that was distinguished economist and ISAS non-resident senior fellow, Dr. and Professor Sanjay Kathuria with us today on the subject of Bangladesh-Sri Lanka currency swap, around which several other subjects pertinent to both countries and South Asia were discussed. Hope you enjoyed the conversation, and please follow us on the social media and elsewhere to tune in to more of our podcasts. Thank you. Have a very nice day ahead.